Thank you, Michelle, and thank all of you for having me here today. Scholars of Black Canada, with the notable exceptions of James Walker and George Elliott Clarke, have been remiss in mapping what I think of as the genealogical trajectories, right? The histories of the study of Blacks in Canada, right? The history of writing about Blacks in Canada. In the academic realm, the genealogical ordering of texts are part and parcel of the process of canonization. Canons, once established, lead to the establishment of fields, respectability, prestige, and power, or at least what passes for power in the academic realm. Nonetheless, these sorts of endeavors, particularly as they pertain to Black Canadian scholarship and its archives, have been called melancholic by Ronaldo Walcott in his widely read critique of George Elliott Clarke's work. Can you hear the feedback here? Is that me? What am I doing wrong? Why is there feedback? It's okay now? Okay. Walcott charged that Clarke's work was melancholic, as he put it, because of its excessive compulsion with cataloging Black Canadian experiences. Said Ronaldo, rather, and those of you who are familiar with this long-running feud, long-running feud between these two figures in Black studies will be conversant with the terms of the debate or the argument. I diagnose his cataloging strategies as melancholic. His compulsive cataloging or list-making of places and names and elsewhere books and authors is ironically important and not important. I make the claim for Clarke's various lists as melancholic because what sits behind them is an impossible desire to belong to the nation. A nation that forms him, but a nation that cannot imagine him within its own formative narratives. And this was part of Ronaldo's salvo to George in the revised edition of Black Like Who. And actually, Ronaldo had shown remarkable restraint up to this point. I think George had published about 10 reviews of Black Like Who, all of which were quite negative. Walcott goes farther to take Clarke to task for merely attempting to, quote, suture a particular formation of Black Canadians to the normative nation. Walcott's critique, if I understand it correctly, has implications for this symposium as well. Though the charge of melancholia might have been a touch strong, in a sense Walcott is right, and his observations bear some weight on this panel, which has been tasked with assessing the scholarly work of Daniel Hill and its implications for, in my case, Black Canadian historiography. I'm going to speak as an historian and how I see the legacy, the dual legacy of Daniel Hill's work. There is indeed something approaching melancholia about the desire of scholars of Black Canada to constantly evoke the origins of our intellectual traditions, to anoint pioneers of one sort, and to anoint pioneers of one sort or another. And invariably, the subject of historical inquiry is either anointed a pioneer or simultaneously is the scholar who writes the pioneer into history. And it is precisely, in Hill's case, I feel, and I'll go on to talk about this later, that the pioneer is written into history in a double sense. So both the writer and the subject of his inquiry. But it is precisely this longing to write ourselves into the normative history of a country that again cannot imagine us within its founding story, that is both strangely a form of intellectual insurgency and a symptom of near melancholia, a yearning for national belonging in a rather violent state settler colonial project that was and is Canada. I want to suggest that Daniel Hill's work was a pioneering body of work, which established, at least in part, a historical sensibility through which Black peoples in Canada were placed at the center, or the center of the margins of historical processes. Rather than as the passive recipients of white largesse. While aspects of the work indeed approach melancholy, punctuated by the naive liberal notion of the subject as the agent of historical progress, it is also evident that there is an emancipatory post-colonial standpoint in and through which the text is written from the margins of Canadian history. So it's this ambivalence of a historical project that is once implicated in Canadian colonialism and written from a post-colonial epistemic sensibility that I want to explore in what follows with my talk. I mean, those are the ambivalences that I say frame Daniel Hill's work. And much of Black Canadian historiography, I think that was to follow. So let me begin by talking about Hill's first significant scholarly work, and there have been many references to it throughout the day. And that was his 1960 University of Toronto doctoral dissertation, Negroes in Toronto, a Sociological Study. And this relatively little known but quietly influential work, not so quietly influential now, but I think when it was first penned, examined a number of themes in contemporary Black Canadian life. And this was an analysis of the Black experience in Canada that was indeed grounded in history. The first two chapters of the book, in a mode of analysis typical, or the first two chapters of the thesis rather, in a mode of analysis typical of how non-historians often deal with history, provide the historical background for the ethnographic study, the social anthropological study of Black life in Toronto that was to follow. And the chapter was a comprehensive and thoughtful exposition of the history of Black slavery and settlement in Toronto. The dissertation is written and structured in a style evocative of the temporal sensibilities of many of the intellectual and cultural productions of those who I say typify a certain kind of Black modernist intellectual tradition. One can see that Hill's sense of history is what frames the analysis, right, the subsequent analysis of the Black community to follow. The dissertation is evidence of Hill's staggering intellectual curiosity and his interdisciplinary orientation, even though it was formally submitted as a sociology thesis. In this sense, the work is resonant with the work of W.E. Du Bois's seminal sociological studies of Black Philadelphia at the turn of the century, and Du Bois's also seminal The Souls of Black Folk. Sociologists of Black Canada can speak about the extent to which Hill's social anthropological study of Toronto has influenced subsequent generations of sociologists and social scientists. I don't feel like I am qualified to speak on that legacy. But one can certainly see, or I can certainly see, the influence that his work has had on a subsequent generation of Black Canadian academics, such as Wilson Head, Clarence Bain, and even a classics professor like the University of Ottawa's John Harewood. But while the bulk of Hill's dissertation was in the realm of social anthropology, most of Hill's post-dissertation academic work was in the realm of academic history. And although Hill published a number of shorter historical essays on the history of Blacks in Canada, and more specifically Toronto, The Freedom Seekers represents the culmination of his historical endeavors. Though it is often referred to as a popular history or as a book directed to a youth audience, it received serious critical review by University of Waterloo historian James Walker in the Journal of Canadian Ethnic Studies a year after the book was published. In many respects, The Freedom Seekers is a deeply conservative, normative historical text. This is signaled, to my mind, on the book's cover. While Hill, like the vast majority of authors, of course, did not produce his own cover art, the image that appears on the book is deeply resonant with some of the book's major themes. The cover image features a procession of Black people marching toward the foreground of the picture. And you remember seeing it this morning on the slide, so just hold that image in your mind. Presumably toward the North Star, right, the fabled North Star, and on to Canadian freedom. Upon closer examination, one sees that the cover is adorned with Black people wearing mid-19th century garb. Class is subtly, though not overtly, gestured to here, much like the book to follow, as one readily sees that the outfits of the figures are variegated, right, the different outfits. Some are clearly adorned in the shabby garb of slaves, others appear to be farmers, and a handful are dressed in the garb of the Victorian upper middle class. There's a few pillbox hats and fancy dresses in the procession on the book. The largest figure at the front of the line is an elderly Black woman. Her hair is covered, and there is a satchel slung over her left shoulder. She looks off into the distance towards a vista beyond the purview of the viewer, and the gaze is steely and determined. Her right arm hangs straight downward, and in her right hand she grips the neck of a rifle. In her crooked left arm rests its barrel. So these are the freedom seekers at the heart of Hill's narrative of early Black Canadian settlement. And this is a sensibility that has both enormously helped and hindered, in some respects, the development of Black Canadian historiography. There are many difficulties that emerge with the image of the freedom seeker at the center of Black Canadian historiography. First, in many ways, this is a very conventional sort of history that it mostly, though not entirely, replaces white historic figures, right, pioneers, with black ones. James Walker criticized the book for its failure to, quote, to apprise the reader of, quote, the significant internal dynamics of a separate black community life, which enabled blacks to make those very contributions. Individual effort was rarely enough, end of quote. And while I do not necessarily share the preoccupation of many of my colleagues in Black Canadian history with locating the genesis of Black community, a concept which I feel is just as often evoked for conservative and retrograde social positions as it is for its emancipatory possibilities, I agree that Hill's work often fails to adequately grapple with the historical structures and the role in shaping history. Hill's final chapter, titled The Freedom Seekers, is instructive. It is a compendium of biographical sketches of 18 exceptional figures in the history of early Black Canada. So what sorts of difficulties emerge from these biographical historical sketches? Despite the heroic image of the female freedom seeker on the book's cover, almost all are men. Moreover, the ways in which these men are written into history is often merely an attempt to present the founding history of the country in a black face without an interrogation of these founding narratives. A case in point is Hill's sketch of William Hall, a figure that has gone on to be memorialized in various government and non-government sponsored commemorative Black history endeavors. The Canadian government even issued a stamp in Hall's honor. Hall was one of the first Canadians, and I think he's the third Canadian, and the first person of African descent to be awarded the Victoria Cross for his role in defeating a mutiny of Indian nationalists who were engaged in something that's called the Indian Uprising in 1857. The celebratory rendering of this tale has become the standard account. It's literally reproduced dozens of times through various media. The problems with it, nonetheless, are readily apparent. Neither Hill nor his intellectual heirs have adequately probed the tensions at the heart of a figure like Hall. Hall was a descendant of a slave who came to Canada to escape the racial terror and barbarity of the US slave system. While Hall must have suffered the indignities of white supremacy in Nova Scotia growing up, Hill does not mention this in his book. In Canada, he was free from the shackles that his father had to endure in the US. Yet Hall only fully ascends to his lofty place in the Canadian national imagination as a consequence of his active role in the violent perpetuation of British Empire. Hill's uncritical rendering of Hall as a freedom seeker is deeply problematic, and scholars of the Black experience in Canada have been too quick to follow Hill's lead in this regard. Figures such as Hall complicate the trope of the freedom seeker, and this is worthy of serious scholarly attention. A similar pattern emerges in Hill's discussion of Blacks in the armed forces. Like the story of Hall, you can throw tomatoes at me after. Like the story of Hall, Blacks' involvement in putting down the 1837 rebellion, crushing the 1840s Welland Canal strike that was heavily involved Irish workers, or the Black soldiers who protected the British colony of Victoria, as we know, protected Victoria from Americans, but also presumably from hostile First Nations people. Hostile First Nations people also has to be subject to greater historical scrutiny. We need to be more honest about the ways in which the Black search for freedom and full citizenship in Canada could align with the prerogatives and imperatives of Britain's colonial state and empire. The treatment and erasure of First Nations people in Hill's work is also deeply troubling. Now, despite the fact, as Alan Borovy told us in the previous session, that the activist work Hill did with First Nations people was quite a significant part of his activism. One of the only figures who is mentioned at any length, and by this I mean Aboriginal figures, are those tribes who own slaves, including those tribes, individuals who own slaves, including slave owner Joseph Brant, who is worthy of the attention or worthy of the criticism that he gets in Hill's book. He's quite a cruel slave owner. In the main, however, First Nations people are often the absented presence in the shadow of his historic pioneers. As many others have pointed out, including most recently Paula Madden, Black Canadians were not just innocent pioneers. Their arrival here was often predicated upon the removal of First Nations people. Secondly, neither does Hill adequately explore how the structure of ideas that coalesced around things like race and empire shaped the fortunes of the subjects in his book. In sum, in general, there is too much emphasis on the individual in this book, too little interrogation of Black's troubled relationship with the British colonial state, virtually no analysis of how historical materialism, and I am guilty of this in my own work, shaped the fortunes of Black workers on the edges of British North American agrarian, post-mercantilist, and early capitalist order. One sees these sorts of tendencies reflected in much of today's historical scholarship on Blacks in Canada. Hill's historical work had its limitations, and these are limitations which again can be found in much of the newer scholarship on Blacks in Canada. But Hill also made some crucial contributions to the field. Again, Hill placed, and we've been hearing about this all day, and I think it's a crucial point, Hill placed Black subject at the center of historical inquiry. Though he was indebted to the contributions of scholars such as Fred Landon and William Rennick Riddell, I argue that Hill's writing was strikingly quantitatively different from some of the figures that preceded him. While he sought the counsel of these scholars through the writings they had left behind for him, Hill wrote the histories, or his histories of Black Canada through a different lens than they did. And his goal was not to showcase the beneficence of white Canadian society or its superiority to the US, but to highlight the triumph of Black humanity and dignity in the face of Canadian-born and bred white supremacy. Though to be sure, I think Hill would have been much more diplomatic than I've just been with the language that I've used. Hill did not erase the history of Blacks' struggle for freedom in Canada. Hill did not erase the history of whites' role in Black struggle for freedom in Canada, and no responsible historian would. And frankly, it would have flown in the face of his own personal choices and the composition of his very family. Nonetheless, in Hill's work, Blacks did not play a subordinate role in how their story unfolded. It is telling that he chose the phrase, quote unquote, building together to highlight the theme of interracial friendships and cooperation in his work. It is the idea of Blacks' rootedness in Canada, however problematic or even melancholic in some respects, that makes Hill's work and the subsequent works that are written in this vein so powerful in the ways in which they seek to refashion a dominant narrative of Canadian history, even if they often do so with imperfect tools. And while Hill was surely aware of many of the contradictions that shot through his work was a work of its insurgent intellectual praxis. Though we have been told to limit our remarks to Hill's academic work on this panel, I doubt whether he would have drawn such a sharp distinction. And I didn't know him, obviously, but this is a sense I get from reading his stuff. I don't think he would have been comfortable with such a sharp distinction, if any, between his work as a human rights activist and his scholarship. Indeed, the orientation of the freedom seekers towards a youth and/or general audience is evidence that Hill did not want to reproduce the highly technical and specialized body of knowledge that he generated in his dissertation. As one of the founders of the Ontario Black History Society, it is also evident to me that for Hill, history was something more, was something that was to be entered into, rather, the public realm to inform struggles of marginalized groups, and to give the larger society a greater appreciation for the multicultural nature of Canadian history at its founding. Again, while the rhetoric of Blacks as one of Canada's founding peoples is troubling in some respects, the rewriting of the national narrative from the margins, however unevenly, does have value and does have emancipatory possibilities for those who have been racialized as Black in the Canadian context over space and time. So in conclusion, Hill's academic scholarship leaves us, or maybe not you, but me, with a difficult, complicated, and somewhat ambiguous legacy. There are elements of the work which reinforce, to my mind, a normative, almost conservative vision of Canada and Blacks' place within it. The trope of the pioneer, the freedom seeker, to a great extent overdetermined, in my view, Hill's narration of Canada, and it did so at a the expense of a critical interrogation of Blacks' often uneasy alignment with the colonial project and colonial power. Since the writing of Hill's book, there have been too many similarly celebratory accounts of Black history, mainly focusing, as Hill did, on Black Canadians of exceptional merit, be they successful entrepreneurs, abolitionists, journalists, or abolitionists. Just as the discourse of respectability was a feature and a fixation of Victorian upper middle class life, so too has it become a fixation of too many historians of Black Canada. Surely this is a function of the reality that literate elites leave behind the sorts of records that historians relish, like diaries, newspapers, and the minutes of those philanthropic organizations that are like a gold mine when you find them in the archives. But surely there are other facets of Black Canadian life that are worthy of serious historical inquiry. While the history of social Canada has long been the broader history of the writing of Canadian social history has longly been engaged with exploring the histories of some of society's most marginalized populations, historians of Black Canada have been reluctant or even hostile to doing so. Our fixation with Black nation builders means that there is an ostensible chill towards the sort of work that would explore the histories of Black criminal defendants, for example, prisoners, sex trade workers, and denizens of insane asylums. Are they not worthy of our attention, our recognition of their full humanity? These two are histories of Blacks and the Canadian state, and our unwillingness to do this sort of history, with the stunning exception of the emerging work on the history of slavery in Canada, is precisely what makes so much of Black Canadian history appear to be so antiquarian at times, almost quaint and frankly miles behind developments in broader Canadian social, cultural, and even political history. Ironically, Hill's doctoral work explored precisely these sorts of issues in some of the later chapters in the dissertation. But in The Freedom Seekers, the work that was meant for broad public dissemination and consumption, Hill was all too willing to retreat to the politics of Black respectability. What Hill's work does provide, nonetheless, is an important example of the importance of the role of the scholar activist and the ways in which the activist historian can contest who belongs here, who can lay claim to this country, and press for the role of history in the full realization of a democratic and multiculturalist vision of Canada. And I mean multiculturalism in the best sense, not, what do they call it, saris and samosas, right? But real, substantive multiculturalism, which is about equity of power and possibility. Much of the work that has been produced in Canada since the publication of The Freedom Seekers has done precisely that. There was a certain power in tracing the history of Black peoples to the country's origins. The point of doing so is not necessarily to perpetuate a form of melancholia, nor a misguided attempt at the indigenization of Black culture at the expense of later and less authentic arrivals and interlopers, but rather to put a lie to the all too frequent claims that Blacks in Canada have no historical legacy. While it is important to bear the shortcomings of the sort of triumphalist history that Hill and others wrote in mind, we must also remember that the work was transformative in multiple ways precisely because he was writing it from the purview of the subaltern. It is from the margin that the true nature of a society is revealed, as are the possibilities of its future. Hill's scholarship is still important. Historians both inside and outside of the academy still engage with his work, and we will be in conversation with his work for years to come. Thank you.